One of the reasons why I really enjoyed reading your book is because I see, even from my own experience, how easily I can be seduced by the notion that the model I'm using to get to a particular goal is certain and correct, and I can become trapped and embroiled in it, or even that the goal I'm pursuing is the correct goal. And
yes.
reading your book has
Well,
really helped me to recognize those two very different states of mind, and how what an active process it is to try and get out of that and get to a point of embracing uncertainty.
well, yes, I like the word active process because I believe that all processes are not linear, they're not unidirectional. So all interactions and all of life is relational and interactional. In fact, I would say that going beyond that, and I argue in the book, supported by physicists, that relations can be said to be prior to relata, to the things that are related. That may make no sense because according to the world picture we have, there are just things out there isolated, and we put them together, and it's our making of relationships. But in another way, you can't know what those individual things are until you see the nexus of relationships in which they exist, which also alter what they are. So once you've taken them out of that nexus and out of that context, you have changed their meaning. I often refer to the fact that John Dewey said that, a great philosopher in my view, said that the greatest mistake in all of philosophy is its tendency to decontextualize. That's a very important point, I think. And there's a danger in the practice of psychiatry and in all of the way we think nowadays, broadly in our culture, that we tend to decontextualize things. We abstract a phrase, a word, an idea, a belief from a whole nexus of things which qualify it and may indeed invert the meaning of it completely. So what I would say about the idea of the understanding of a person is that we have to see that person in that context. And I think that when we talk about reason, for example, I would like to qualify that, much as I'd like to qualify science. So it might be thought that in my discussion of epistemology, how do we find our way toward truth, that to point to science and reason and intuition and imagination is to line up the right hemisphere against the left. But this is not the case at all.
They work in tandem.
They not only they work in tandem, but to divide it like that is at right angles to the way in which the fault lines lie. They don't lie between science and reason and judgment and imagination. They lie between a left hemisphere interpretation and a right hemisphere interpretation. So let me take science. What we're taught at school is that science is this purely objective, logical procedure whereby you start from no preconceptions and you carry out experiments according to a multi-step process called the scientific method, and you then have firm conclusions. I don't want in any way to undermine what I'm going to say. It doesn't in any way undermine the importance of science. In fact, it sets it on a firmer footing, which is to say that it's not just this most unimaginative, uncreative process. It couldn't be, as I pointed out before. We can't just assume that all possibilities are equally likely, or we'd never arrive at any conclusions. But also, as I point out in the book, and I don't think this is controversial, science does make many first assumptions that go unexamined. It wouldn't be able to get off the ground without them. It's just the pretense that it doesn't make them. I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying it's the rhetoric that it doesn't make assumptions that needs to be questioned. But when you look at the story of the really great scientists who made the big discoveries in, say, physics or in biology, indeed, too, and mathematicians, when you look at the story of how they reached their conclusions, as George Gaylord Simpson himself, one of the founders of the, the whole modern synthesis, which underlies mainstream science, said that it's very unusual that actually in practice anybody is really found to be following the quote scientific method, which is more a theory that's been parked and is useful to draw on, and it's a bit of rhetoric. Well, we use the scientific method. But if we did that, we wouldn't be very intelligent. We'd be more like machines that have been programmed to do stuff. But actually, fortunately, mathematicians and good scientists are very intelligent and imaginative people. And in the arriving at their conclusions, their stories are absolutely clear. They rely on hard work and reason, but they also rely a great deal on pattern perception, on seeing a gestalt, that's the kind of whole that is more than just the sum of the parts, and on a kind of intuitive insight, which often comes after a long period of allowing something to go fallow, and then the insight comes. So science is, and that part we know is robustly associated with the right hemisphere. So insight is particularly associated with the right superior temporal sulcus and the right amygdala. But that kind of insight, which is behind all creative processes in science and in the arts, is very right hemisphere dependent. But we also use the left hemisphere procedures up to a point. So it's grounded in intuition. It ends up in intuitive insights. And in the middle, there may be a lot of hard slog done by the left hemisphere. The trouble is that in the picture we now have of it, the only bit that's important is this intermediate step done by the left hemisphere. Now, the same thing is true of reason. Reason, importantly, in many languages, particularly of the ones I know, Greek and Latin and German, has different words for different types of reason. And we just seem to have this one word. And so I have created a distinction between what I call rationality and reason. Rationality here, I have to use in a special sense, which is the kind of reason that is based entirely on abstract procedures in the way that you could feed something into a computer and it could spew out a result. Whereas reason is something infinitely subtle and complex, as Pascal himself said, I mean, after all, one of the great mathematicians of all time, that it is a very fine and subtle thing that is very hard to specify, but it comes from the coming together of the practice of understanding logic, of course, with an ability to understand by experience, by intuition, by one's emotional and social intelligence, what is going on here. And it's the sort of thing that in the past, one would have admired a good judge for and prized a good judge for being able to exercise. Increasingly in our world, everything is becoming subject to a left hemisphere take of bureaucratization, rules, procedures, best practice, and people's hands, doctors and judges and lawyers and so on, all these people who have an embodied skill from years of experience, they're being made to follow tram lines, which actually takes them away from this wisdom. Now, that wisdom was anciently seen by people like Aristotle and Plato as being this different kind of understanding. I mean, Aristotle uses 5 or 6 different words for a kind of knowledge. And so he's therefore distinguishing different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of reason, which we now conflate to one, which is the mechanistic model. And just before I finish this, sorry,
rationality.
Before I just finish this riff, there's something very important about the model. You mentioned this earlier, you know, we need to see outside the model. We can't understand anything without a model, anything, because a model is a way of saying, how can I get a handle on this? I think it's like this, which to an extent I can say I understand already. So that's what we mean when we say I understand something, is we approximate it to a model that we think explains what we're talking about. And so they're necessary, absolutely necessary. But we need to be examining how good the model is and trying other models. It's again coming back to the Japanese Zen garden, that from where we're standing, we're seeing some of it, but not what we'd see if we moved around the garden. And that's really what we need to be doing, is saying, yes, a machine model illuminates this, but it doesn't illuminate that. And in that, this and that, I'm not suggesting that they are symmetrical. There is a tendency in our thinking always to think that if there are two options or more, that they must all have equal validity, but they don't. There is absolutely no basis for believing that at all. Almost everything in this world is asymmetrical. And what the right hemisphere sees is more important than what the left hemisphere sees, and it can embrace it. So it doesn't turn its back on it. It doesn't say there's something wrong with what you're doing. It doesn't say, it just says this is not enough, and it takes it back and incorporates it into a bigger picture. So really what I'm getting at is that there are some models that can embrace lesser models. And at the moment we're stuck not only with one model, which is never good enough, but with one of the lesser models. And that is a great shame, because I think it's limiting science quite unnecessary.
Yeah, it's a bit similar to how Newtonian physics is nested within Einsteinian physics. Like Einsteinian physics can account for Newtonian physics and more, and therefore is a better model. And you need to have a model because reality is simply too complex. But the danger is either becoming overly attached to a model, mistaking bad models for good models, falling in love with your model. Or I guess the worst one is to mistake the model for the territory, or the map for the territory.
So true. So profound and important an observation. It's one that's been frequently made. And one of the ways of distinguishing between the left and the right hemisphere is that, if you like, the right hemisphere is better at contacting the real presence that is there, whereas the left hemisphere represents, which already means it's no longer present, but after the fact, a version of it, a scheme of it, which is necessarily diminished. Now, a map relates to the world and is useful because it doesn't have very much information in it compared with the reality it maps. It has only 1,000th of the information. It wouldn't be a better map if it had more information. But the huge mistake is when you say, this map, that's the reality. And then we start thinking we're living really in this map. And I believe that's where we are now. And in fact, I would make a claim that it's not clear that we still live in a world at all. We exist in a simulacrum of that world that is of our own making.
More and more as we create abstractions of abstractions of abstractions.
That's right. And you see this evidence, not just at, obviously this applies at higher levels of philosophy, up to what is the cosmos and, you know, what is the nature of its foundational elements, which I explore in the new book. I look at time and space and matter and consciousness and value and purpose, and even the notion of the sacred and the divine. What can we say about these things, knowing what we know about what the brain is capable of telling us? So we need to be examining those things and not just accepting our representations of them, because the representation changes enormously what it is. This is particularly important when it comes to time. Time, we are so attached to our representations that we think time can be simulated by a line drawn on a sheet. And we're here now, we will be there in the future, and so on. And in that, you can find a point retrospectively, because it is a representation, an after the fact simulation of something, which in reality is neither static, nor has this sort of linear structure, nor is composed of moments of time, points of time. Those are an aspect of the map or of our diagram.
That's our interpretation of what's happening.
Yes, and an analogy that people will understand, I hope, is what is a line? Well, you might say it's an aggregate of many points, but a point has literally no extension. I mean, that's the definition of it. So it doesn't matter how many points you put together, you will never arrive at extension. Even an infinity of them will never give you the extension of a line. If you imagine pencil points, you're already smuggling extension in because the smudge of a pencil point already has extension. So although you can perfectly correctly say there is a point in a line, which I can now in my diagram say, I'm going to treat that as a point. The line is never made up of points. Extension, you cannot get from a point to extension in a single move or any number of moves. Something new has come in. As you can't get, and Aristotle and Plato were honest enough to see that this was a problem with the rather left hemisphere way they were beginning to conceive the world, nor can you get from stasis to motion. In the Newtonian universe, stasis is primary, and what one has to account for is motion. Some force comes along and puts things in motion. What we now know is that there is no such thing as stasis. It's an entire fabrication, if you like, of the left hemisphere's representation. Everything, always, without exception, is in motion. All you can do is reach asymptotically a moment when motion is so reduced that you can discount it. Mm-hmm. But it's always there. And they, Aristotle and Plato, accepted that it was paradoxical. They asked this question and confessed they didn't have an answer to it. When a stone is put in motion, before it's put in motion, it's at rest. After it's in motion, it's in motion. But what happens at the very moment when it begins to be in motion? At that moment, is it at rest or is it in motion? And what that illuminates once again is this idea that motion can be made out of something from stasis, but motion is something sui generis. It is not composed of lots of bits of static anything.
So are you saying that there's no such thing as being at rest because everything is dynamic, everything is constantly in motion? Essentially.
I am saying that, and of course, I'm not denying that in everyday life things are, for most purposes, we can identify that they're pretty much static. But what I'm saying is that these are convenient fictions, and there's nothing wrong with having convenient fictions. We can't live without them. You know, for example, if I want to build a garage, I don't really need to take into account the curvature of the Earth. But if I am going on a journey for thousands of miles, I do need to take account of the curvature of the Earth. And it's not
the curvature of the Earth is a factor whether you acknowledge it or not.
And that's right. And in a way, that's an analogy for what you said earlier, quite rightly, about the relationship between Newtonian physics and quantum physics. It's not that in the local level, Newtonian physics is correct, but as you go to bigger or smaller quantities, it becomes incorrect and something else takes over. Quantum physics is applicable at every single level. It's just that at the local level, you can, for most purposes, discount certain things. And that's really what I'm saying, is that if we take a narrow enough view, a local enough view, some of our bits of model can be effective. For example, I believe that all systems are effectively complex systems. We may believe that complexity is something that is built up out of simplicity. So at first there are simple systems, and then either they are put together with other simple systems, become more complex systems, or somehow they're complexified. I believe, in common with many physicists, that complexity is the grounding foundational state, and that the idea that there is such a thing as simplicity is, again, a convenient mental fiction, which is achieved by, once again, as always, by narrowing focus. So if you narrow the focus enough, if you take a very, very complex system that is actually not just unpredictable because we don't know enough, but intrinsically unpredictable, you can find in it perhaps somewhere in all this elaborate network of interacting cascades, which map the sort of thing that goes on in a simple cell, single organism that is a single cell, 10,000 interactions that have cascades that interact with one another in a second. You can take that map and focus in on a certain point, and you can find just for a little while, 2 or 3 arrows that go from A to B to C. And if you do that, you can say, oh, I want to intervene there. I can produce a result. And you do intervene there and you do produce a result. So you think, how clever. I actually understand it. It's a machine. It is not a machine for 8 or 10 reasons that I go into in the book. So it's this business of narrowing down one's focus. It's not that it's untrue exactly. It becomes untrue when you take it to be the whole truth.
It's
As the philosopher
untrue,
Iain McGilchrist said, and he's somebody I very much admire, there are many half-truths, and that's fine. It's when you start taking them for the whole truth that plays the devil, as he said.
I think there's even a Buddhist saying, there's a Buddhist saying that every truth is but a half-truth, which is a reminder of, I suppose, of humility. Something I'm really curious about, we were talking before.